Russia today is becoming increasingly desperate, and nowhere is that more obvious than in recent statements by Vladimir Putin. Russia for years had thought that it had leverage over the West because the West was dependent on Russia. And in the case of gas in Europe, it was certainly the case. We saw for years that Europe was buying Russian gas, but today that's no longer the case. Before the full scale invasion, it was a significant part. In fact, about 45% came from Russia. But now it's a much smaller percent. In fact, it's about 13% of total EU gas imports. But today, as Russia has less leverage over the West, while it still has this window of opportunity before Europe stops buying Russian gas, it believes it must act. It must do something now to show the West that it still has some power, that it still can control what happens in Europe. But as time is running out before Europe stops buying Russia's gas, we see something else is going on in parallel. In parallel, we see that Russia is getting weaker. And right now, it all makes sense. Why is Putin threatening the West right now? It's because Russia has never been weaker. My name is Dr. Jason Smart. I'm a Kiev Post special correspondent and a national security advisor. What we see is that Russia is trying to regain coercive power as its options narrow. But you can help us get to the world the truth that Russia today is not strong. Russia is incredibly weak, and Vladimir Putin is in no position whatsoever to command anything of the West. Keep in mind, it's his economy that depends on the sale of this. Without it, Russia has some significant problems. So help us get to the world the truth of what's going on. That Russia today is not in a position to negotiate, not from strength. It is in a position of weakness, and that is why today more pressure can be put on Russia, and it should be. Help us get the word to more people by simply subscribing now, liking this video, sending it to others, sending a hype, and consider becoming a channel member today. So there's a reason that Vladimir Putin today, though, is nervous. That's because increasingly Ukraine is carrying out attacks within Russia. Look at the attacks in Novorossiysk. That's Russia's key Black Sea port. Attacking that port, that affects all of Russia. That affects Russia's ability to export oil. It affects its shipping internationally. And that is something that Russia is not prepared for. Keep in mind, Russia is a very big country, but there are very few ports that it can use that have warm water access. More than that, very few ports where it can fix its ships. So when a port like Novorossiysk is attacked, that's something that could destabilize all of Russia. Undoubtedly, Putin is hoping to leverage the sale of gas to Europe with the Europeans to get them to agree to put pressure on the Ukrainians to stop these attacks. Fortunately, the Europeans do not seem inclined to do this. But there's something else going on that's very important. Vladimir Putin has a big problem. Shipping something like oil, which Russia does, is very doable with a shadow fleet. You get some ships and you send it. It's complex because typically out in the middle of the sea, they transfer from a sanctioned ship to a clean ship in order to bring it to port in other countries. But it is much, much harder to export LNG, much harder to export gas. And when you're trying to do that, it becomes almost impossible. Keep in mind, for years, the Chinese have promised to buy Russian gas. But today, they're becoming increasingly disinterested. Aside from China, there's very few large countries that need Russian gas. It's hard to get, it's a long distance, and the price would be higher. So Russia today understands it needs new clients. But as Ukraine is carrying out increasing attacks against the Russians, attacking things such as Russian ships that are carrying LNG, that means that it makes it impossible for Russia to maintain its economy. Already, about 40 to 45% of the Russian national budget comes from the sale of oil and gas. But due to increasing sanctions from the West, that makes it impossible for Russia to sell it. It has to sell things like this at a deep discount. But those discounts, that's adding up. We see that Russia's deficit is only increasing. But there's an additional reason that Vladimir Putin today is becoming increasingly concerned. Look at the increasing sabotage in places like Lugansk or in Pokrovsk direction. We see there that the sabotage is knocking out the Russians' ability to continue controlling the region. But Russia's also facing problems in Belarus. We see there are mobile groups that are now being trained to shoot down drones that come from Belarus. That's in addition to the fact that the Russians at this point are also worried about shooting things down. But in their case, it's a little bit different. We saw over Milarova that they shot down an M8 helicopter, their own helicopter. That's what Russia is shooting down, because today Russia is becoming more trigger happy, and that's something that happens when you're nervous. But there's a very legitimate reason for Russia to be nervous. Right now, their front line is becoming weaker, and as their front line becomes weaker, the chance of a breakthrough increases. Russia, keep in mind, month to month, is now lacking 9,000 soldiers over the month before. To combat this, Vladimir Putin has recently signed a decree. According to the decree, the Russian military would increase in size to about 2.4 million people, including about 1,500,000 in active duty. Now, what's interesting about that is that Vladimir Putin has got really huge ambitions, considering that he already cannot find enough people for his military. So where will they get them from? Where will they get the soldiers they need to continue fighting this war? Well, according to Russian military bloggers, that's why Telegram stopped working in Russia. They want to start drafting people. And there's very few things inside of Russia that can make Vladimir Putin as incredibly unpopular fast as drafting people. Now, if a draft were to break out in Russia, what would that look like? Well, let's consider this. When the full-scale invasion began, already 4 years ago, we saw that about 1 million Russians fled the country. The top reason that they fled wasn't because they're political dissidents. It's because they feared a draft. So we can imagine what it would look like if, again, the Russians were headed in the direction of a draft. There wouldn't be probably many people signing up to join the forces. And that's why Putin today is looking on how to react. What can he do right now to put pressure on Ukraine or to protect Russia, given that his options have become very few and very far between? Now, there's something else, though, that Vladimir Putin is probably not anxious to talk about, and that's that today, with the lack of Shahed drones, the parts they need that will not be coming from Iran, it will only get more difficult for him to continue waging this war. So if he's going to make any gains, if he's going to keep his front line from breaking, he needs to do something different. He needs a paradigm shift. But a paradigm shift for Russia, that's going to be very difficult. Keep in mind, they're using soldiers with virtually no training who are sent to the front. What good are those soldiers? We've seen the news stories coming from Uzbekistan that women in prison are getting letters offering them $25,000 to join the Russian military, considering that some towns inside Ukraine typically greet Russian soldiers with a 12-minute life expectancy. It's a safe bet that it's going to be very difficult for the Russians to get enough men to continue fighting. Russia currently is not fighting like it did in earlier wars. Russia, of course, is famous during the Second World War and the First World War and earlier wars as well, that it won or was able to survive due to the massive size that it had. That, along with brutal winters, always defended Russia, because Russia ultimately does not treat its soldiers like people. It treats them as objects. It treats them as simply a material good. But if you view your soldiers as a material good, that inherently means you do not think of them as the West does. In the West, like in Ukraine, we treat the soldiers as people, which they are. The Russians do not. They view them simply as a product to be used, to be serviced and thrown away. But that no longer adds up when the other side has a cheaper means of defeating those soldiers. Consider this. If a Russian soldier is recruited for $25,000 and he's killed within 12 minutes by a Ukrainian using a $500 drone, that means that you're going to be running through a lot of money to try to get through those lines. And given all this pressure right now on the Russians, it's precisely why right now we should be helping the Ukrainians to win. You could help us do that by checking out the first pinned comment below and helping us make a contribution to save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. Thank you. So Ukraine has got an advantage. Russia will bankrupt itself trying to fight that kind of a war. However, that strategy, it doesn't allow Russia to move ahead. It allows Russia to get itself into a stalemate. And that's why today Russia is trying to figure out a new strategy, what it can do differently. By increasing the size of the military, there's a hope they could simply overwhelm the Ukrainian ranks. And that strategy would probably be more effective. However, it comes at a massive cost. If Vladimir Putin were to start mobilizing soldiers, it could be something that destabilizes his country. And destabilization is the very last thing that Vladimir Putin wants to see. He knows that any day there could be somebody else who takes advantage of these disgruntled soldiers, takes advantage of the fact that soldiers don't want to fight. Keep in mind, it was during the First World War that the Russians started to lose their country. The Tsarist regime eventually fell, and the communists took over. And when they took over, one of the things that contributed to it was the breaking of the front. Soldiers in the Tsarist military simply decided they didn't want to fight, and they walked away. Now, already in the Russian military, where we see soldiers increasingly deserting, we see soldiers killing their officers. It's going to be very difficult to get in people who don't wish to be there, people who are there under duress. So Vladimir Putin, it's more than simply the ability to get the Europeans to put pressure on Ukraine. He needs the ability to put pressure on his own people. And when his own people don't want to fight, it is going to make it very difficult. But let's consider another factor here. Right now for Vladimir Putin, we see that he's facing a challenging situation back at home. There is a lot of money being spent in Moscow. People there are living decently, so they don't feel that there's significant problems. But the data that's coming out from Russia shows that there's increasing problems. We see what's going on in the banking sector. We see what's going on with inflation. And we see that if this war were to stop tomorrow, Vladimir Putin would face an economic crisis. In fact, that's something that Vladimir Putin is probably not aware of, because the central bank today is not doing what's necessary to control the inflation that's growing. In fact, it's printing more money. And that's what happens when you have massive deficit spending, as Russia now has. Keep in mind, just in January, they spent more than the anticipated deficit for all of 2026. So Russia cannot afford to continue fighting this war as it had historically, and Russia needs some new options. It's of course hoping that the general situation internationally, it's going to put pressure on other countries, and those pressures will mean that nobody will pay attention to Russia. However, for Vladimir Putin, that doesn't mean the problems are going to get better. It could, in fact, mean things will get worse. Because today, as there's more of a black market, there's more countries right now that are in a state of chaos. That means that Russia is not the only country trying to sell cheap oil and gas. There are other options as well. And the black market economy doesn't operate like a normal economy. It's quite diverse. Putin today is in a situation that his regime has never been in. One where no longer can he call the shots. Nobody is in desperate need for what he has to sell. If you're selling a product that nobody needs, how do you put pressure on them? For Putin, there is no easy answer. We see in the regions of Russia today that there is increasing discontent. We see there that regional governors are complaining already that they don't have enough money. They cannot keep things together. And the people there are becoming disgruntled. And as the people in Russia become more disgruntled, as the situation continues to worsen, it means that for Vladimir Putin, he will have more problems at home. And despite the fact that today, Vladimir Putin has a ton of Russian soldiers inside of Russia, the entire Rosgvardia, or Russian National Guard, of an estimated 350,000 to 400,000 soldiers, that might not be enough to actually put down an insurrection. Russia is a massive country. There are people everywhere. And if people are not in Moscow and putting down an insurrection in somewhere like Chechnya, that means that Moscow is left unguarded. But for Putin, he would have to choose. What is more important to him, Chechnya or Moscow? Obviously, Moscow is far more important. And that's why probably he's very concerned today with his lack of capacity and lack of cash, that Chechnya is becoming more disturbed. We see there that the heir to the throne, the son of Kadyrov, he was in an accident just a few months ago. He was left blind in at least one eye because of it. But increasingly, it looks like an IED was used to explode his carriage. Now, if his car was in fact attacked by groups opposed to him, that means that we will see clan warfare, probably in the near term, in Chechnya. And that warfare could quickly transform the face of Russia. For Vladimir Putin, he is facing greater problems and greater risk. And that's why we should not be surprised at all that he's making these demands of the Europeans, that he today is pretending that he's strong, that he's tough, that he could put pressure on Europe. The fact of the matter is quite a bit different. For Vladimir Putin, he realizes that time is running out. As time is running out, it's not him to put pressure on the Europeans. Rather, now is the moment for the Europeans to tell Putin, no thank you, because it is the Putin regime that is at risk right now. Thank you for supporting Ukraine.